A rusted steel drill meets a single drop of dark, viscous blood. Then comes the sickening wet crunch of a human skull yielding to a silver chisel. You are brutally pinned down by 4 heavy, unyielding men. Their leather aprons are stiff with the dried gore of the morning's failures. There is no anesthetic offered here, and absolutely no mercy. There is only the suffocating stench of stale gin on the surgeon's breath. He does not see a terrified patient looking back at him. He only sees a vessel of bad humors that must be violently purged. As the cold metal bites through your temple, the world dissolves into a blinding flash. You are now hearing a sound no human is ever meant to hear from the inside. We like to desperately believe that history is a steady climb toward enlightenment. We pretend ancient doctors were always guided by a noble desire to do no harm. We are entirely and comfortably wrong. For centuries, the hospital was never a sanctuary of healing. It was a terrifying, blood-soaked theater of the grotesque. The thin line between a master surgeon and a professional executioner was merely a clean silk coat. In the shadows of Victorian wards, the cure was a brutal ritual of endurance. More often than not, the physician was your most terrifying symptom. So where exactly is the boundary between a life-saving incision and ritualistic mutilation? How much of our modern medical safety is built upon a foundation of unrecorded screams? This is the deeply dark evolution of the human medicine cabinet. A journey into an era where a doctor's visit was a death sentence disguised as hope. Tonight, we pull back the heavy velvet curtain on the most horrific solutions ever devised. These are the 7 terrifying times in history when ancient doctors made things much, much worse. To understand this theater of cruelty, we must step away from the blood-stained surgical table and wander out into the suffocating fog of a 19th century metropolis. The air hanging over these narrow cobblestone streets is thick with the scent of raw sewage, burning coal, and the undeniable lingering perfume of early mortality. In this shadowy world, disease is not understood as a microscopic invader, but rather as a heavy, corrupting cloud of toxic air known simply as miasma. People genuinely believe that breathing the wrong foul breeze or dwelling in the damp darkness is more than enough to rot a human body from the inside out. But the true horror lies not in the invisible vapors haunting the alleyways, but in the absolute, unquestioned collective ignorance of the era. You must understand the prevailing worldview of these centuries, where rudimentary science and deeply rooted superstitious dogma are woven together in a tightly knotted, inescapable thread. The human body is viewed not as a complex biological engine, but as a fragile, fleshy vessel containing 4 distinct, highly temperamental fluids called humors. Health is merely a delicate balancing act of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And illness is absolute proof that your internal tides are dangerously overflowing. Therefore, the logical solution to any mysterious malady is never to nourish or protect the failing body, but to violently purge it of its excess, rotting corruptions. This terrifying philosophy creates a society that fundamentally equates intense physical suffering with the necessary, inescapable process of profound and life-saving purification. If a medical treatment causes agonizing pain, induces violent sickness, or leaves the patient pale and trembling, it is universally deemed by experts to be working perfectly. Agony is viewed as the bitter medicine of the immortal soul, a necessary penance demanded by an unforgiving nature and endorsed by the silent, towering spires of the church. In the minds of the desperate, uneducated masses, to endure the rusted blade or swallow the bitter poison is to bravely fight back against the creeping shadow of death. And who are the architects of this agonizing salvation, these confident men universally trusted to carve into the flesh of fathers, mothers, and helpless children? They are the esteemed wealthy physicians, men wrapped in heavy velvet coats, speaking exclusively in hushed, authoritative Latin phrases that the common folk cannot possibly comprehend. They wield immense social power and cultural influence, their diagnoses accepted as unquestionable decrees from the divine, their rusted instruments viewed as the holy tools of deliverance. A starving peasant or an exhausted factory worker would never dare to question a gentleman of medicine, even as their loved ones slowly bleed out on a wooden chair. To question the word of the doctor is to question the very fabric of civilized society, to challenge the educated elite who supposedly hold the sacred keys to human longevity. This absolute, terrified deference creates a catastrophic echo chamber where centuries of deadly medical errors are continuously repeated, celebrated, and blindly passed down as undeniable medical wisdom. It is an era completely devoid of the scientific method or peer review, relying instead on the dusty, untested pages of ancient philosophical texts written by long-dead scholars. The patients are merely collateral damage in a grand, deeply misguided experiment, their silenced voices and agonizing final moments buried under the heavy dirt of overflowing pauper graveyards. Society accepts these profound horrors because the alternative is to face the terrifying reality that they are entirely helpless against the dark, creeping decay of terminal illness. They choose to place their blind, unwavering faith in the confident men with the silver knives, preferring a brutal, agonizing attempt at a cure over sitting in quiet, inevitable despair. Thus, the tragic cycle of medical terror turns effortlessly in the dark, fueled equally by the desperate hope of the dying and the arrogant, fatal ignorance of the learned. His fatal illusion of healing through immense suffering brings us into the private, dimly lit chambers of a desperate, unnamed gentleman of high society. He is merely a faceless silhouette trembling in a heavy velvet armchair, utterly defeated by endless months of unrelenting, agonizing pressure inside his own skull. In this era of supreme medical ignorance, his crippling migraines are definitively diagnosed as a dangerous accumulation of putrid vapors trapped beneath the bone. The esteemed physician arrives under the cover of a starless night, carrying a worn leather satchel that rattles softly with the heavy weight of impending doom. There is a solemn, ritualistic quiet in the opulent room, broken only by the frantic, shallow breathing of the terrified patient waiting blindly for salvation. Heavy velvet curtains are drawn completely shut to block out the corrupting night air, trapping the scent of fear and burning tallow candles inside. The doctor withdraws his prized instrument from the darkened leather bag, revealing a hand-cranked steel auger that gleams wickedly in the dim, flickering candlelight. It is a specialized cylindrical saw designed explicitly for the brutal, unforgiving art of boring a perfect circle directly into a living human head. The patient's hands rigidly grip the wooden armrests, his knuckles turning a ghostly, translucent white as the cold metal is pressed firmly against his feverish temple. There is no merciful slumber offered to numb the incoming terror, only a thick leather strap clamped tightly between his teeth to muffle the inevitable screams. The physician begins to turn the heavy brass handle with a practiced, terrifyingly steady rhythm, applying an immense crushing pressure downward onto the fragile bone. At first, there is only the wet, tearing sound of the scalp parting under the serrated teeth, releasing a sudden warm cascade of dark crimson. The thick blood flows rapidly down the side of the gentleman's pale face, pooling heavily in the starched white collar of his expensive linen shirt. But the true auditory horror arrives moments later, echoing loudly through the suffocating silence of the lavish bedchamber like a gunshot in a subterranean crypt. It is a dry, resonant, grinding crunch, the unmistakable, sickening sound of rigid human bone, slowly splintering under the relentless friction of the rusted steel. With every agonizing rotation of the handle, the jagged teeth bite deeper into the skull, sending violent shockwaves of pure, blinding agony through his nervous system. The vibration travels down his spine, a mechanical, rhythmic grinding that reverberates within the hollow cavity of his own head, drowning out his frantic, muffled groans. To the educated doctor, this horrific, splintering noise is nothing more than the triumphant sound of medical progress, the sound of a sealed prison finally breaking open. He truly believes that with one final forceful push, the toxic miasma and demonic internal pressures causing the terrible malady will evaporate into the stagnant room air. A sickening pop signals the total breach of the inner cranial wall, exposing the fragile, pulsing membranes of the brain directly to the filthy, soot-filled environment. Fine, white dust from the shattered skull drifts lazily through the stagnant air, settling like a macabre snowfall upon the dark velvet upholstery of the surrounding furniture. The unmistakable metallic scent of fresh, hot blood mingles heavily with the sickening sweetness of burning wax, creating an atmosphere that belongs entirely to an abattoir. The physician steps back to admire his ghastly handiwork, entirely unaware that the unwashed, blood-stained tool he just used was contaminated by countless previous doomed victims. The immediate release of physical pressure provides the exhausted patient with a fleeting, cruel illusion of relief, a brief moment where the blinding headache miraculously vanishes. He slumps backward into the damp, sweat-soaked cushions, his heart racing wildly as he mistakenly praises the brilliant man who has just condemned him to a slow demise. This temporary euphoria is the ultimate betrayal of the ancient procedure, tricking the desperate mind just before the inevitable, shadowy descent into total physical collapse. Over the next several days, the exposed, gaping wound becomes a highly fertile breeding ground for an invisible, multiplying army of aggressive, flesh-destroying bacteria. The gentleman's initial gratitude slowly morphs into a profound, delirious nightmare as a raging, uncontrollable fever takes complete hold of his rapidly failing, defenseless body. His opulent chamber transforms into a purgatorial cell, echoing with desperate, incoherent whispers and the restless, violent thrashing of a man being consumed from the inside out. The physician returns merely to observe the catastrophic decline, stroking his chin in deep philosophical contemplation, while completely absolving himself of any terrible underlying responsibility. He solemnly notes in his leather-bound journal that the lingering corruption in the patient's blood was simply too entrenched for even the finest surgical intervention to overcome. It never once occurs to this distinguished gentleman of science that the filthy, rusted saw itself was the true harbinger of the creeping, unstoppable rot. The anonymous silhouette finally breathes his last ragged, shallow breath in the darkest hour of the night, entirely alone despite the presence of his expensive, helpless servants. His tragic demise is not recorded as a horrific medical failure, but rather as an unavoidable act of divine will, an unfortunate but inevitable conclusion to chronic illness. The bloody instrument is hastily wiped clean on a dirty linen rag, placed carefully back into the dark leather satchel, and carried away into the unforgiving city streets. It remains primed and ready to offer its brutal, agonizing salvation to the next wealthy, desperate soul willing to pay a premium for their own excruciating execution. This was the sacred, terrifying covenant between the afflicted and the healer, a blindly trusted relationship built entirely upon a foundation of profound, inescapable torment. Yet, in the eyes of the polite, deeply ignorant society of the time, this blood-soaked ritual is the absolute pinnacle of sophisticated human achievement and scientific mercy. The brutal mechanical violence of the surgical saw eventually gives way to an entirely different, far more insidious breed of creeping, quiet devastation. We leave behind the blood-stained wooden chairs of the surgical theater and descend into the suffocating, claustrophobic gloom of the apothecary's hidden laboratory. In these windowless subterranean rooms, the heavy air is permanently laced with the sharp metallic tang of sulfur and the sickly sweetness of decaying botanical extracts. Here, beneath the erratic, trembling glow of a solitary tallow candle, rows upon rows of opaque glass vials guard secrets far deadlier than any rusted blade. The learned physicians of this dark era earnestly believe that if the physical body cannot be successfully cut, it must instead be chemically conquered and broken. They abandon the iron scalpels and begin to dabble with elemental forces they cannot possibly comprehend, trading immediate surgical agony for prolonged, inescapable systemic torture. The undisputed king of this toxic cabinet is a shimmering, hypnotic liquid metal that fascinates the desperate minds of the highest medical authorities. Quicksilver, known to modern science as mercury, is exalted as a miraculous, holy panacea capable of purging the deepest, most stubborn corruptions from the human flesh. Patients suffering from the shameful, creeping scourge of syphilis are locked away in dark, sweltering rooms and subjected to the agonizing terror of heavy salivation therapy. The suffocating regimen demands that the afflicted individuals be vigorously rubbed down with thick gray mercurial ointments until their skin is slick with the heavy poison. The doctors confidently assert that the devastating disease will literally pour out of the body through a violently induced, never-ending stream of bodily fluids. In reality, this shimmering miracle cure is methodically dissolving the patient from the inside out, beginning a relentless assault on their fragile, unprotected nervous system. The heavy metal slowly infiltrates the bloodstream, turning the victim's gums a bruised, necrotic black before their teeth begin to loosen and fall onto their pillows. The jawbone itself eventually begins to soften and rot away, collapsing under the sheer corrosive weight of the supposed cure that they endure every single night. Yet the doctors stand by the bedside with quiet, arrogant approval, taking the grotesque physical deterioration as undeniable proof that the heavy medicine is working perfectly. When the mind of the patient finally shatters under the chemical strain, descending into the violent, trembling paranoia of mercurial madness, it is deemed a necessary sacrifice. But mercury is not the only phantom lurking within these shadowy, damp laboratories, waiting patiently to be bottled, sealed, and sold to the desperately dying masses. Arsenic, a tasteless and odorless white powder, is elegantly mixed into sophisticated tonics and prescribed to fragile women seeking a cure for their nervous exhaustion. These elegant, delicate glass bottles promise a swift return to radiant health, a subtle aristocratic glow that society heavily desires and universally admires. What the doctors fail to comprehend is that this highly sought-after porcelain complexion is merely the very first stage of total catastrophic systemic organ failure. The patient consumes a few drops of the bitter liquid each morning, completely unaware that they are quietly saturating their liver and kidneys with pure, unadulterated venom. As the weeks turn into months, the subtle poisoning causes crippling abdominal cramps that are immediately misdiagnosed as the original illness simply flaring up once again. The tragic, fatal irony is that the physician will confidently double the toxic dosage, rushing the agonizing patient closer and closer toward their inevitable silent grave. This is the era where the concept of the healing arts transforms into a macabre alchemy, a blind, desperate fumbling in the absolute, terrifying dark. The laboratories themselves feel like heavy stone tombs, filled with the endless clinking of glass stoppers and the slow, rhythmic grinding of the mortar and pestle. Every crushed mineral and every distilled poisonous vapor represents a chilling testament to a profession blindly navigating the delicate borders of human mortality without a compass. There is a profound, suffocating weight to this particular brand of suffering because it is delivered not through a sudden, violent strike, but through deliberate, trusted routine. A patient lying in their own bed, carefully measuring out the very droplets that will extinguish their life, is a tragedy of unimaginable quiet proportions. They sip the poison from silver spoons, trusting the educated men whose portraits hang proudly in the grand, echoing halls of the finest medical institutions. The doctors remain entirely insulated from the horrifying consequences of their prescriptions, shielded by their immense wealth, their high social standing, and their unwavering, dangerous pride. When the silent victims finally succumb to the unbearable internal ravages of heavy metal toxicity, the cause of death is simply recorded as a weakness of constitution. The dark, dust-covered ledgers of these hidden apothecary shops are filled with the names of thousands who paid exorbitant fortunes specifically to be chemically tortured. It is a silent, creeping massacre hidden behind the respectable facade of medical progress, carried out one perfectly measured, elegantly bottled drop at a time. And as the flickering candlelight dances across the labels of these toxic bottles, it illuminates a terrifying truth about the deeply flawed nature of human authority. We are forced to realize that the most dangerous environment in this brutal, unforgiving century is not the dark alleyway, but the quiet, trusted physician's study. The absolute trust placed in these beautifully decorated glass vials transforms the desperate hope of the afflicted into the very instrument of their own agonizing demise. No amount of prayer or frantic, tearful bargaining can reverse the devastating cellular damage once the heavy metals have taken root deep within the fragile bone marrow. The Laboratory of Shadows claims its victims without ever spilling a single drop of blood, proving that the most efficient killer often wears the mask of a savior. We have wandered through the shadowed corridors of rusted blades and toxic glass, witnessing the staggering scale of our ancestors' medical suffering. But beneath the heavy, suffocating layer of this historical tragedy lies a profoundly unsettling twist that modern science rarely dares to acknowledge aloud. Every single agonizing failure, every fatal dosage, and every shattered skull secretly paved the horrific, bloody path toward our current medical enlightenment. We must confront a deeply uncomfortable paradox about the men who orchestrated this relentless theater of pain in the name of human progress. Were these esteemed physicians brilliant pioneers bravely navigating the pitch-black frontier of human anatomy, or were they simply monsters in velvet coats? When a solitary man willingly pours corrosive acid down the throat of a trusting patient just to observe the effects, what do we call him? If he performs the brutal act in a dark alleyway, society swiftly hangs him as a deranged, irredeemable psychopath driven by sheer malice. But if he performs the exact same act within the echoing marble halls of a university, society immortalizes his name in heavy bronze plaques. This is the ultimate, terrifying hypocrisy of the medical awakening, a chilling realization that our greatest leaps forward required an ocean of innocent blood. Consider the meticulous, intricate anatomical maps that currently hang in every modern doctor's office, detailing every hidden nerve and delicate blood vessel. Those precise, beautiful illustrations were not drafted through divine inspiration, but through the systematic, illegal butchery of the poorest, most vulnerable citizens of the era. The undeniable genius of the time was intrinsically tied to a complete, chilling absence of basic human empathy for the subjects bleeding on the table. To accurately map the delicate, hidden pathways of the nervous system, these highly educated men required a constant, fresh supply of human bodies. They enthusiastically hired desperate, hardened criminals to violate the silent sanctity of the graveyard, ripping grieving mothers and fathers from the cold, unforgiving earth. And when the midnight harvest of the overflowing cemeteries proved entirely insufficient for their insatiable curiosity, the physicians turned their calculating gaze toward the living. The tragic, forgotten victims of the decaying asylum and the crowded pauper wards became the unwilling, unconsenting raw materials for the grand laboratory of progress. Is it truly possible to separate the miraculous medical knowledge we possess today from the profound, unpunished evil that was required to obtain it? Can a civilized society truly claim the moral high ground when its very survival is built directly upon a hidden foundation of stolen, butchered corpses? The doctors of this dark era possessed an intellectual arrogance so monumental that it completely blinded them to the devastating human cost of their ambition. They truly believed they were fighting a righteous, necessary war against death itself, and in any grand war, massive civilian casualties are considered entirely acceptable. But look closely into the dead, clinical eyes of a Victorian surgeon standing proudly beside his heavily strapped, deeply terrified living patient. Do you see the compassionate, troubled soul of a desperate healer, or do you see a predator meticulously studying its trapped, helpless prey? The shocking truth is that the fragile boundary between a visionary genius and a calculating psychopath is often determined entirely by the final result. If the brutal, deadly experiment ultimately leads to a miracle cure a century later, history quietly forgives the hundreds of lives violently extinguished beforehand. We retroactively grant these aristocratic butchers a noble grace, pretending they knew exactly what they were doing all along in the suffocating darkness. We desperately need to believe they were brilliant, because the alternative implies that human existence is just a fragile, terrifyingly random experiment gone entirely wrong. It implies that the sturdy foundations of modern health were built entirely by arrogant madmen who simply guessed their way through the fragile human flesh. This terrifying realization completely shatters the comforting modern illusion that medicine has always been a gentle, inherently compassionate pursuit of the greater good. The very same corrosive poisons that slowly melted the jaws of the innocent eventually taught us the precise, delicate chemistry required to develop life-saving treatments. The horrific, frantic amputations, performed entirely without anesthesia, forced the miraculous invention of numbing agents, born purely from the desperate need to silence the endless screaming. Every single sterile comfort you silently enjoy in a bright modern hospital was violently purchased with the agonizing final breaths of an unnamed, forgotten ghost. We are merely the incredibly fortunate inheritors of a massive, bloody fortune, gathered through centuries of unpunished crimes committed bravely in the name of science. So ask yourself, as you comfortably swallow your daily medication without a single passing thought of fear or hesitation regarding its safety, are we truly the enlightened, superior generation? Or are we simply the lucky ones who arrived long after the most gruesome, deadly experiments finally concluded? The ghosts of the hidden apothecary and the blood-stained surgical theater remain completely silent, but their immense suffering pulses quietly through every single beat of your heart. Behind the heavy leather-bound volumes of medical history and the polished bronze statues of celebrated surgeons lies a vast, silent, and forgotten ocean of human sorrow. We must strip away the clinical terminology and the academic distance to look directly into the terrified eyes of the countless nameless souls who paid the ultimate price. Imagine a vast, cavernous hospital ward at the dead of night, illuminated only by the pale, indifferent moonlight slipping through tall, iron-barred windows. There are dozens of narrow, iron-framed beds arranged in strict militaristic rows, each one holding a shivering, faceless silhouette wrapped tightly in damp, coarse linen. These are the discarded remnants of the lower classes, the exhausted factory hands, and the starving mothers who had absolutely nowhere else to turn in their darkest hour. When they walked through the imposing archways of the charity hospital, they were systematically stripped of their names, their families, and their fundamental human dignity. They ceased to be living, breathing individuals with cherished memories and deep loves, immediately becoming nothing more than interesting biological puzzles for the learned men to solve. Picture a single, anonymous patient lying flat against the unforgiving chill of the heavy wooden operating table, completely isolated from everything they have ever known. The room is swallowed by deep, high-contrast shadows, isolating the victim in a small pool of trembling light that offers absolutely no warmth or comfort. They stare helplessly up at the towering dark silhouette of the physician, a terrifying figure who holds the absolute power of life and death in his unwashed hands. There is no loving hand to hold, no gentle whisper of reassurance to calm their racing heart, only the terrifying clatter of rusted steel instruments being prepared nearby. The profound loneliness of this exact moment is a heavy, suffocating weight, far more agonizing than the sharp bite of the cold blade that will soon follow. They realize with a crushing, silent despair that they will never again feel the warm embrace of their child or see the golden sunlight of another morning. As the shadow of the surgeon descends upon them, the only sound in the suffocating stillness is their own rapid, shallow breathing echoing against the damp stone walls. We must pause to truly feel the immense crushing weight of their solitary terror as the heavy leather straps are pulled brutally tight across their fragile chests. This is the ultimate heartbreaking tragedy of the grand medical awakening, where the most vulnerable members of society were sacrificed on the altar of unproven scientific curiosity. When the unbearable physical agony finally pushes their exhausted consciousness past the breaking point, there is no peaceful transition into the waiting arms of the divine. There is only a violent, desperate gasp for air in a dark, uncaring room, followed by the slow, fading rhythm of a heart that simply cannot endure anymore. The heavy, metallic scent of blood hangs thickly in the stagnant air as the flickering candlelight catches the final silent tear slipping quietly down a cold, pale cheek. Their final breath leaves their lungs as a barely audible sigh, a tragic, invisible vapor that dissipates instantly into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the cavernous surgical theater. The learned doctors merely step back and wipe their hands on their filthy aprons, casually making a brief, emotionless notation in a dusty ledger about an unsuccessful procedure. There is no mourning, no respectful silence observed for the extinguished universe of thoughts and dreams that just collapsed forever upon the blood-stained wooden planks. The hollow shell of the victim is hastily unbuckled and carried away into the shadows, destined for the dark, overcrowded horrors of an unmarked pauper burial ground. They are buried several layers deep in the damp, frozen earth, their identities entirely erased from the permanent, celebrated record of human medical advancement. They sink into the absolute blackness of history, leaving behind no inheritances, no grand monuments, and no grieving families who were ever told the true, horrifying story. Yet, these faceless silhouettes are the true, unsung martyrs of our modern world, the silent pillars upon which our entire foundation of health and safety was brutally constructed. Every time we wake up safely from a deep surgical slumber, feeling the gentle touch of a caring nurse, we are living a beautiful miracle violently denied to them. Every single drop of sterile medicine that runs smoothly through our veins was paid for entirely by the horrific burning venoms that completely destroyed their fragile bodies. Their unrecorded screams echo endlessly through the pristine, sterile hallways of our contemporary hospitals, an invisible, haunting debt that we can never possibly hope to adequately repay. We owe them the profound dignity of our memory, a solemn acknowledgement of the terrifying darkness they endured alone so that we might walk safely in the light. The human cost of our survival is a towering mountain of forgotten bones, sleeping quietly beneath the cobblestone streets, waiting patiently for a moment of true, heartfelt recognition. Let us stand completely still in the quiet shadows of their memory, deeply feeling the heavy, sorrowful weight of the innocent lives crushed by the arrogant machinery of progress. We must never look away from the dark, painful sacrifices of the voiceless, for their solitary deaths in the shadows bought the very breath we take today. We stand today in the sterile, brightly lit sanctuaries of modern hospitals, surrounded by the gentle, reassuring hum of advanced digital monitors. We feel incredibly safe and profoundly evolved, entirely disconnected from the brutal, blood-soaked history that meticulously paved the way for our survival. But this pristine illusion of immaculate, painless healing is nothing more than a beautiful cathedral built directly upon a vast, unacknowledged graveyard. We must finally answer the haunting question that opened our descent into this terrifying, shadowy theater of historical medical atrocities. The definitive boundary between a life-saving surgical incision and a barbaric ritualistic mutilation is drawn entirely with the blood of previous generations. Our entire foundation of contemporary medical safety is constructed upon a heavy, silent bedrock of screams that were forcefully silenced in the dark. Every single miraculous vaccine, every soothing anesthetic vapor, and every flawless surgical procedure we enjoy was violently purchased through ancient, unimaginable agony. We absolutely did not achieve this towering height of medical enlightenment through sudden flashes of divine inspiration or pure, untainted scientific benevolence. We slowly climbed out of the pitch-black abyss by stepping heavily onto the broken backs and shattered skulls of millions of nameless victims. They were the unwilling, deeply terrified pioneers, forced to brutally explore the absolute darkest frontiers of human biology and lethal chemical toxicity. The horrific, rusted iron tools of the Victorian butcher and the toxic glowing vials of the hidden apothecary directly birthed our modern salvation. We cannot selectively celebrate the miraculous cure while choosing to completely ignore the devastating, murderous centuries of absolute medical ignorance that created it. So we arrive precisely back where we started, staring deeply into the cold, jagged teeth of a rusted steel trepan illuminated by dying candlelight. The desperate, violent struggle to keep the fragile, flickering light of human consciousness from being completely extinguished remains the exact same eternal pursuit. We have simply traded the suffocating, terrifying dogma of the ancient humors for the quiet, calculated, and deeply sterile precision of the modern laboratory. Yet as we look back in utter self-righteous disgust at the barbaric practices of our confident, deeply misguided ancestors, a chilling thought lingers. When 2 entire centuries have passed, how exactly will the enlightened future judge the invasive, brutal treatments that we currently celebrate as undisputed miracles? Will they look at our toxic chemical therapies and our aggressive radiation treatments with the exact same horrified shudder we reserve for the bloodletter? History brutally and consistently reminds us that the absolute celebrated state of the art is very often just a highly sophisticated form of ignorance. We are all just fragile, desperately hopeful patients lying in the dark, waiting for tomorrow to finally tell us what we did completely wrong. The heavy, unforgiving iron operating table has never truly disappeared from our lives. It merely hides beneath a perfectly clean, white linen sheet. The shadows of the past will never truly release their heavy, suffocating grip on the pristine, brightly lit corridors of our modern medical sanctuaries. We walk blindly forward, carrying the silent, inherited weight of a million unspoken tragedies, permanently bound to the restless ghosts of the ancient surgical theater. True, lasting healing has never been a gentle, miraculous gift handed gracefully down from the heavens to cure our fragile, failing human flesh. It has always been a bloody, violent concession, a desperate and terrifying bargain violently ripped directly from the unforgiving, cold hands of death itself. The next time you find yourself resting comfortably upon the crisp, clean white paper of a modern examination table, close your eyes and listen very closely. If you hold your breath in the heavy silence, you might just hear the faint, echoing, metallic whisper of a rusted, forgotten silver blade. It is a chilling, invisible reminder echoing through time, quietly telling you exactly what horrific, agonizing price was paid to keep you safely breathing today. If you found yourself deeply captivated by this unforgiving journey through the agonizing, shadowy evolution of human survival, do not let your curiosity extinguish here. Leave your own permanent mark on this dark historical record by sharing your reflections below, and tell us which terrifying era we must investigate next. Ensure that you remain permanently tethered to this growing archive of shadows, for the dusty, forgotten pages of history hold far more grotesque secrets waiting for the light. A new, carefully sealed chapter of profound human tragedy and calculated madness is already waiting for your brave inspection, floating quietly somewhere on your screen. Step carefully into that next terrifying mystery, and always remember that the deepest, most dangerous darkness often hides directly beneath the blinding, sterile laboratory lights.